Welcome to Orbicle Times Podcast, and hello to everyone, whatever part of the globe you're from or happen to reside in. My name is Kelly Jo, and here we'll provide armchair conversations gathered from interviews and research reviews to explore the seen, the unseen, and the in-between of the supernatural paranormal phenomena, with topics that circle around Spirit Orbs, NDEs, OBEs, UFOs, time slips, mystical moments, higher consciousness, and more. I hope that this cast will be our meeting place and judge-free zone where we can explore, learn, and grow through the telling of. This cast will be launched on a monthly basis or a bi-weekly schedule whenever I'm able to make contact with those in the know for their telling of. Speaking of those in the know and the telling of, have you had mystical moments or other supernatural paranormal experiences? Care to share on this cast? Then consider stepping into the light with your telling of, or send in your monologue for me to read on this podcast. Simply email orbicletimespodcast@gmail.com for a chance to contribute to this cast. I started to think that I guess Jesus might have been the first well-known NDE'r.
I'm with you. He sounds like an NDE'r to me.
Doesn't he?
100%.
I think
and totally
so.
as misunderstood.
Yeah. In this 13th episode of Orbicle Times, Part 2, guest Peter Panagore was able to stick around for a bit of a chat, which circled around such topics as mystical messages from the other side, integration through meditation, plus the making of medical mystics, reincarnation, and spirit animals. Please note, listener, that we brush up against the topic of suicide. And so, without further ado, here is that interview. And a warm welcome to you, sir. Thanks for
Kelly Jo.
Thanks, Peter. You know, do you have time for some questions?
I would love to spend some more time with you.
Okay, great. Now, but you know, when I heard your telling of the first time, which I don't know, it was a while ago. When I say it was a while ago, I mean when you were telling the story, not when I was listening to it. But I wanted to know what had happened to your sister. Was her name Andrea?
Her name was Andrea.
Yeah, and that was the reason, I guess, or one of the reasons, what drew you away from home was because Andrea had run away from home. So you were experiencing whatever dilemma and pain that was going on in your household. What happened to her? If you don't mind me asking.
Well, no, I don't mind. A lot of things happened to her. And I didn't begin to learn about what happened to her till 2006, when she began a reestablishment of communication with the family. But it's a long saga and story of where she lived and what happened, and the rapes and the babies and the communes and the hippiness and the art, and then right after we started this end of our long estrangement, she died of a heart attack in 2007, and she died with drama. And we had to fly down to South Beach, Miami. She was living in a hotel where she was managing this kind of a flop house place, but she was always neat and clean. But I had just begun to get her story out of her. We had just begun to talk, and the police contacted my family, and they thought that she'd been murdered. And she wasn't, but we didn't know that for weeks. And I flew down there with my brother, and the result of all of that was that in her death, my mom finally found some peace, the beginning of her peace. So I was going to write a book about her. Her stories, I could tell. Oh my God, her stories, and people, because she was in the East. There's a newspaper called Cape Cod Times, and she was in the Cape Cod Times, which a lot of Bostonians get. And so this woman contacted me, someone who knew her when she was in Haight-Ashbury, and started telling me stories about my sister. It was just this astounding end. And And it's an ongoing saga. Even though she's gone, there's a lot of parts of her still here.
Hmm. How many years had it been before, from the time that she left until somebody was in contact with her?
Well, that's a tricky question because for several years, every Christmas, she would send a postcard from where she had been and not where she was. Once a year, a postcard.
Wow.
And then one year, what year was this? I was a senior in high school, 1977, and she showed up for dinner one day. Like she'd been gone for 4 years, and she walked in the door for dinner just around Christmas with a 2-year-old in her arms.
Wow.
And 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 then she stayed for a month with the baby, and my dad got her a job and rented her apartment, and there was childcare. And then one blizzard day around Valentine's Day, she hitchhiked and vanished again with the baby in the blizzard. And then she was gone until my last year of divinity school, which is 7 or 8 years later. But in the meanwhile, she had been arrested for neglect, and my parents threw her bail money, and she left the United States for Canada and left behind 2 babies, this 2-year-old and a brand new baby. And we adopted the 2-year-old, but we couldn't get the baby because she fell too quickly into the system.
Right.
And then it was until my graduate year of divinity school where she showed up again. And then there was trauma with that because she accused my family of kidnapping the baby, which we rescued. And then she vanished again. And then she was gone until 2006. So every single time she came back, there was all this destruction. And I loved her through all of this. So there was like not a single moment that I stopped loving her. Angry at her, extremely. Feeling of abandonment, absolutely. But even after I was in div school when she showed up this time, my last year of divinity school. I'd already died. And so the turmoil that she created when I was there was only so much the witnessing of the pain she caused to other people and not so much to me. I still had anger at her, but my love for her was overwhelming. I was in this period of my life where so much love came back with me that I became indiscriminate with it. It was just pouring out of me through very little control of my own, which I tell you, got me in trouble with men and women on a regular basis. and but for my sister, with this core relationship with her, I adored her. I adore her. I always have. So that's what happened to her.
Okay.
She's come. Oh, go ahead. I
Go,
have
no,
questions. I
no,
could
no,
talk
no,
more
no,
about it,
no,
but go ahead.
no, go ahead. No,
She
please.
came back twice, not to me, but she came to my mom several years after her death, with my grandparents, my mother's parents, along with her in this visitation after death communication. And she came back and appeared to my mom in this vivid dream type state that you get into when you're aware that you're dreaming and you're aware you're in the presence of a divine being. Everyone who dies and comes back is a divine being. And my sister came back and apologized to my mom for all the pain that she had caused. In her lifetime, she didn't know, but in her life review, she saw. And she came back with apologies. And my grandparents standing behind her, beaming love the whole time, all of them, and which caused some healing for my mom. And then my dad, who had been Greek Orthodox growing up and had nearly gone to seminary, through this process of this wicked pain that was caused in his life and this anger that grew into a shell around him. God rest him now. He's gone back home again and freed from all of this. But in the later part of his life, she came to him. And in this dream, he was sleeping in his recliner chair, and he's long retired. And he's lying in the recliner chair, and she shows up in his dream and communicates to him love, and he has this experience of love and well-being. and I don't on his phone, on his watch. So he wakes up from this dream with this now kind of like shock that he had this experience, and his watch had some word on it. Like, I don't remember what the word was. I want to say it was love, but that's probably not the word. But something like that. That it was he had this cheap digital watch that he'd had for like 40 years that was way out of date and was always glitzy, going on and going off, but it had a word on it that was significant to his experience with her in the dream, and I can't remember what it is. And now he's gone back home again, and he came to visit me. Anyway,
in a dream?
After he died a year ago this month, after 3 years of great suffering, like bad health at the end, like terrible bad things like that, which happens to people, and in his early 90s. And during the end of which, all he did, he found his faith again, but only to ask that God kill him. Take me home, kill me now, take me home, take me home. And eventually he died some years after that began. And last year, and maybe January this year, I guess, maybe December last year, January this year, I don't remember the date, but that was, I was in a dream state. And in my dream, he appeared we've got this deck in the back of the house with a sliding glass door, and he slid the glass door back and he stepped out like halfway out, and he's looking like he was, and then when he was 40ish, he has this black beard and black hair and black rimmed glasses, and he was an architect, so he's like, he has a bow tie on, and he's looking all this, he's looking healthy and fit, and he communicates. He looks at me and he smiles. And in this smile, as he looks at me, there's this communication of self-understanding and well-being and home and healing. And all of this is just, he's okay, that his life was over and all the suffering is ended, and he's back home where he was. And then I awakened from the dream. And it was after this that I remembered that part of my dream where I saw his death. So near-death experience for me has been this continual unfolding through these 40 years. So it's not like it happened back then to me. It's a living experience now. And through my meditative and yogic practices, in my journey inward, it continues to give gifts. It's this perpetual gift giving. And then I saw their deaths. And now I see my mom's, and that had always been there, but my brain couldn't access this part of my experience, and now I can, through no doing of my own. And it brings me solace, and it brings me comfort, and it brings me an understanding of, myself and my own eternal nature, that I am always inhabiting this body, and that I'm never it itself. And with that comes all this freedom.
Well, as a side note, and I might keep this in, but I don't think so. I just wanted to let you know this. Two things that are interesting in this conversation, I think, is that one, last night I was speaking with somebody and we were talking about dreams. And I thought, wow, I'll write that down. Maybe I'll bring that up. I'd like to bring that up with you, but how do I fit that in to this conversation? And the other one, but here's a funny coincidence, or is it? Just the other day, and I wasn't looking for it either. So that's another interesting point. It seemed like I intersected with a HuffPost article that you wrote about your sister called Love and Grief Come Together. I mean, I can put a link to that in the show notes, but that was sort of an answer for me. Do you know what I mean? Which is kind of weird, but I'm there. Oh, okay. But it's interesting the way that it led into you speaking about dreams. So I find that that's interesting. I don't know, just a little tidbit, I guess, of sort of where my thought was when you mentioned that. So I am sorry to hear for your loss. I guess for your losses, I guess recently, Peter.
Thank you. I think you should leave that in, because it's divine serendipity. It's an example of what it is to live inside the light. And you brought tears to my eyes. My eyes welled up when you mentioned that article. And even so, I miss her. I miss my dad. Near-death experiencers in general, the ones I know anyway, we grieve differently than other people. We, because we know there is no end. I miss them. I grieve the same in my loss. In my loss, I grieve the same. But
Yeah, but
in the,
you know they're home though.
I know they're home with a capital K.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to a little, not very much, still in the same vein, but switch gears because I was curious to know if you're still in contact with Tim.
No, I
Okay.
wish. We
Oh.
tried to find him. So after I was a college student, I had this little time when I was a college, didn't have any. There were no phones. I mean, other than plug into
Sure.
the wall. So
Yeah.
I carried all of my addresses and my phone numbers in this little tiny book, very tiny book, like lots of people did.
Sure.
And I never wrote down his last name, and the only number I had from him was on campus. And after this event, after this happened to us, he was, because I totaled his car with his semi-trailer truck
Right.
on the way home. He never, and it was a brand new car that his dad had bought him to go to Montana and all this kind of stuff. And so even though we had gone through this incredible event, we parted company never to see each other again. I went off in a theater company tour. I was part of a theater that was based at Montana State University called the Theater of Silence. And we embarked on a 24,000 miles, 64 show Western United States tour within weeks of my return. And so that was it. And so when the book was being written, my publisher wanted to find him. I wanted to find him. So they like got a PI involved, a private eye involved, and they did some research into the Canadian Park Service, and we went to the university, and we just, because he was only a one-year student, he didn't graduate from there, we couldn't find him. And so I added a letter to my book. And my publisher made me take it out because he's like, that's an extra page we don't have to print. That costs money. You don't need it. If he reads the book, he'll contact you. So I'm now waiting all these years, hoping that he reads the book, and because he's going to see himself in it. I wanted to write the book with him, basically. I wanted to find out what happened to him and what his perspective was for the night, because I only had my perspective and he definitely had one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe someday.
Yeah, maybe someday with all the podcasts that you have been on, he's bound to hear you soon, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Yeah. At one point when you were up on that ice hill, you saw people, other climbers, heading back down the mountain. And you knew that they saw you and you saw them. Did you think at one point, hey, I should call out or perform the signal for help? I don't know, like a help sign. I don't even know if there is one. But
it's funny that you said that, because I know that they were the last team that was exiting as the sun was setting. They stopped and they looked at us and they raised their arms, and I raised my arms. And I knew they could see me, and they knew that, and they went off, and that was that. And maybe they went and told. So what part of the story I didn't tell last night, maybe they went and they talked to the warden. So the night before, we had driven up to Jasper because we were out of food, and went to a grocery store and we bought a lot of food. But that meant by the time we got back to where we were going to camp, just in the neighborhood of Cirrus Mountain, it was way after dark because this is March and the sun goes down early. And we're like, oh my God, we got to set up in the dark. We don't know where we're going, and we don't have we don't have GPS. We have a topo map, a topographical map, and a compass. And so, but we find the warden's cabin, and as we knock on the warden's cabin, and we interrupt his evening. He's there by himself, and we tell him what's going on, and he's reluctant to let us in. But we convince him to let us in for the night by cooking him. We cook him a meal. We cook him a full meal, a hot meal, and then we clean up, and then we go to bed, and we leave before dawn, before he gets out of bed. That was the deal. And then we signed into the log. So everybody, but this is another thing I hadn't thought of till now. So everybody who was going on that climb was signing into the log. There were people who had come in when we were there who signed into the log. And so we were the last ones at the climb, and they all must have started. I don't know. All I know is that we signed into the log, and we went down to the mountain. And so and when you sign into the log, you say what time you're going in, where you're going, and when you're coming out.
Right.
And that way they can find you in the wilderness. I know in the middle of the night, and the bottom of the second rappel, where we were stuck in another situation where the rope was jammed also, and for different reasons, and how we got out of that was a whole different thing. But during this period when confusion was deepening and our coordination was rapidly being lost, we were tripping in the snow, not able to speak, frozen lips, inability to talk. The warden pulled into the parking lot across the street. We figured it was the warden because he flashed his lights, and we're like, "Oh my God, we can be seen." We're jumping up and down. I always figured it was from that we had signed into the lodge, the log in his lodge, and that he came to see us because we hadn't signed out. But maybe those climbers, maybe they alerted him. I don't know.
He was probably doing his due diligence, right?
He
Checking
was.
the book. Seeing where everybody was, or like you said, maybe it was the other climbers.
Maybe.
And you know what? Which brings me to mind, like maybe there should be a universal signal for like, help. We're screwed here.
I know one for
send
water
help.
skiing. Water skiing. When you're in the water, you stick it was on a water ski team when I was a kid. You stick your arms up over your head. That's the sign.
That's the sign.
That's the sign.
I know there's one for home violence. There's a home violence signal.
There is a home violence signal. It's subtle though.
Yeah. So you need to come up with one. Instead of, the waving of the arms, somebody would be like,
"Hey,
oh, there they are. Okay, hey, good on you. We'll see you later."
Right.
Well, you answered one of my thoughts, which was, did you ask the park warden why he came looking for you?
Oh, no. No. The next morning he showed up. By the time we had warmed ourselves enough, he showed up sometime after sunrise. We were loading up the car because we figured we were warm enough to load the car. We could warm up the rest of the way where our coordination was back. And so we were loading the gear into the trunk of the car when he pulled up in his truck, and he got out of his truck and we're like, "Oh my God, it's the warden." He was the guy. And so we were excited to see him, but also the look on his face said sternness. He said, "Were you the boys on the mountain?" I remember this distinctly. "You were the boys on the mountain last night." And I'm like, and I was closer to him than Tim was. Tim was behind me. And I said, "Yes, sir." I'm like, I drop into the whole Boy Scout, "Yes, sir, no, sir," kind of thing. I'm like, "Yes,
yeah.
sir." "Yes, sir, we were on the mountain last night." He said, "I was coming to see you this morning whether I had to requisition the helicopter to recover your bodies."
He was aware. And good title for a book, Boys on the Mountain.
Yeah.
When you got all warmed up, you, if you will, you rise after your near death. Did you make your way to a clinic or a hospital?
No, that would have been the smart thing to do. That's for sure. And in retrospect and in hindsight, yeah, we should have definitely done that. And I don't really know why we didn't. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe like we just wanted to get home. I don't have any idea why we didn't do that.
You were young. I guess if you were feeling better too.
I was feeling better. And plus, I've been, so maybe I had the bravado of being, I'm trained in first aid.
Oh yeah.
I know what I'm doing. I don't know. It's okay. It was admittedly not people say to me, ice climbing is a stupid thing, right? Ice climbing. Why do you climb? You must have a death wish. So that was just from other points of view. That was just yet another one in a series of poor mistakes, of bad choices. But climbing, just a word about climbing. Climbing is about challenging yourself to being present completely where you are, with your life in your own hands, in the hands of your partner. And it's actually, more people get injured playing American football than they do ice climbing on a percentage basis, because people who are ice climbing, other than me and my buddy, other than Tim and me, people who are ice climbing, you rarely hear about the mistakes they make.
Well, every day when someone gets in their car.
Yeah, right.
That's a risk factor right there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall who the first person was that you spoke to about your NDE?
Oh, yeah. And it's my lifelong childhood buddy, Don, who in my book, there's a picture of me standing on a mountain peak somewhere else, balanced. He's with me. It's like the next year we're out backpacking again. And he knew that I came back a different person. My parents knew that I came back a different person, but they never asked me about it. But I had already decided not to tell anybody. I had already, I'm not telling a soul. I don't understand what happened to me. I don't have any language to describe it. How can I tell someone what happened when I can't speak about it? So I told Don maybe 2 or 3 years later. I didn't tell him right away, but I remember telling him we're on a backpacking trip, and it wasn't in the book because I'd forgotten about it. And Don reminded me about it later. So Don, if you're listening, here it is.
Thank you, Don, if you are listening.
Thank you. What a guy. He's still my friend. Okay. We're still buddies.
Nice.
And so I told my wife on the day, and here's, okay, so in the book, I say, oh, yeah, I told her on the night before we got married, but of course she didn't read the book. And if she had read it before I published it, she would have told me that I told her the day after we got married.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I wasn't telling anybody, because I knew that this was crazy. Okay. I knew enough. It forced me, I was living every moment of every breath I took, every moment of my day, I was witnessing my own life from the outside. I had this extreme radical perspective shift that I still have, only now I'm more integrated and it's more pronounced. I live outside myself, looking through myself all the time. And so I know I have this new perspective, and I know that I'm behaving differently. But I also knew that crazy people do that.
So that would be some of the initial psychological effects. How were you able to integrate back, if you will, into reality after your NDE?
Well, there were several things that I did, and I did it. So I spent most of my life, I spent 20 years in silence about this. Literally, my wife, my buddy Don, and this other guy named Brian, who's in the book, who's also still my buddy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I told those three people and nobody else, zero zippo. Meditation. So I went to this Catholic high school. I went to outside of Boston, and next to this Catholic high school was this monastery. And this Trappist monastery, they developed this things called contemplative meditation through their practice of meditation in the monastery, but also through Theravada Buddhism with Jack Cornfield, who had a monastery nearby in Barre, Massachusetts, and their studies of the ancient mystical texts of Christianity that were repressed. Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, I could name a whole bunch of them. Anyway, they developed this meditation form of meditating into silence, very zazen, no thoughtfulness, no words. And I had begun practicing that in 77 for various reasons I could tell you stories about. But so first of all, I learned integration through meditation and my practice of my chakra-based yoga. I studied right after I came back. I dove into the Eastern literature because I'd had an exposure to Eastern through my studies. So I read the Yoga Sutras and Patanjali and Yogananda and the Tao Te Ching and Chuang Tzu. I read all sorts of stuff, all sorts of the Upanishads and the Vedas. And I read everything that I possibly could read in the first 8 months. And thereafter, I just kept reading and reading and reading. And I discovered in Yogananda and the Yoga Sutras, this interior practice of Kriya Yoga. And because I had I had a yoga teacher, and the school of Marcel Marceau has students around the world. And one of his students was my teacher in mime, who also practiced yoga because that's what Marcel Marceau taught. And he showed me how to find my chi, my prana. And once I found that, I combined these centering prayer, contemplative mysticism, and my own internal yoga practice of breath and mind in combination with my physical asanas. And I integrated myself. And the last thing is that as I dove, the only way out is in. And as I dove deeper inside myself, as I peeled back my own inner layers of my own egoic attachment to my egoic self, as I created a capacity of a containment unit inside of me through these practices, the divine became my guru. And as the veils thinned inside of me, and the divine gave me other mystical experiences that healed me along the way, other radically similar to my near-death experience sort of levels of transcendent integration. And I'd made a great deal of progress with this practice, but mostly it was through the divine grace.
Tell me your thoughts on a perspective that I think that I've noticed is that a common, I would say, theme amongst NDErs. Sounds like kindergartners, eh? NDErs. Sorry.
Well, yeah, we are. I consider myself a kindergartner.
Kindergartners, yeah.
I definitely.
Is that they seem to, many of them become more spiritual and not religious, but spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd agree with that.
100%.
Yeah. And it made me think too about NDErs is that I started to think that I guess Jesus might have been the first well-known NDE'r.
I'm with you. He sounds like an NDE'r to me.
Doesn't he?
100%.
I think
and totally as misunderstood.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking, I was listening to some of your comments in regards to medical advancements. And so medical making of mystics, if you will.
Yeah.
And do you think that there are more NDErs or NDEs in Western countries then?
Oh, not just in the West.
If you preface that with, there's so much more medical advancements in certain parts of the globe. What about the parts that don't have those medical advancements? I know that they experience it, but I don't know how, can that be quantified? I don't know.
I asked a similar question to some near-death experience researchers recently in the past few months. And I asked them whether it could be a study done. And they said, well, basically there was a study done and we're not going to repeat it. So, but that study didn't include, that study only included Americans. And so I was looking, what I wanted to know is what's the number on the globe? How many of us are there? And I'd love to find out about the distribution, because you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. It has to do with medical technology, but medical technology is so advanced now that, and most of the people who come back are cardiac patients. And cardiac patients are often brought back with paddles, and paddles are everywhere. I'm sure they're not. I've been in places in the world where there aren't paddles. There are many places like that, but there are many places where there are paddles and ambulances carry them. So cities and those sorts of places. Yeah, so medical technology is raising the dead and making a whole army of mystics on a global scale, and we're all coming back with this divine connection inside our lives, inside of our hearts. And I read this study this year that was published, and there was this big contest. It was $1 million prize, well, divided over maybe 10 people, by the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Study. And this fellow, and I don't want to say who it was. I think it was Jeffrey Mishlove, but I don't want to say that. I did say that, but I did say that. I think it was Jeffrey. But in any case, the winning essay included, it was all research. They're all scientists, and in this essay, 70% of near-death experiences surveyed used the words light and love. Those two words. And so we can extrapolate from that, from this original study where they estimated 5% of the American population were near-death experiencers, which is like 10 or 20 million people. And that 70% of us use the words light and love. And then you can extrapolate to Europe, at least to Europe and Asia, maybe not to Nicaragua or to, I don't know, some other place that's still struggling financially. There's a lot of us. And there's a lot of us. And so there's a global awakening that's been going on for more than 50 years, since the 1960s when cardiac care first began. There's so many more of us. And you can see all the podcasts that are being in YouTube channels and movies and books, and because people want to know. And so there's this opportunity for all NDErs. And that's the reason why I wrote my second book. Big reason was to get other NDErs to tell their stories. I want us to tell our stories. I'm encouraging people to speak up about it. Tell somebody.
I kind of wonder if there's going to be an organization, I hope not, out there that's going to try to control that narrative. Because I imagine if my thought about many people that have gone through that turn, away from, religion, or they maybe didn't have religion, but still express it in as spiritual and not religious. Like in the day when people couldn't read, and there was only a few people that could, and then they read the scriptures, and and they also interpreted the scriptures for other people. So they had the power of doing that. And once people, started to read themselves, some of that perceived power or real power was taken away. And I'm wondering, with all these experiences, if there's not somebody or some bodies out there going, we got to get in on this, to direct people and interpret for them what their experience is, because they're going through, if you will, kind of like post-traumatic stress for some of them, especially for many of those that didn't have a platform to go to listen to other people's experiences. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't even know what exactly I'm saying. It's just something that was what I just sort of thought about, and can sort of feel or see that somebody would want to do that. And on the one hand, I say, hey, it's really good for people to hear other people's similar experience and also make them feel, okay, I'm not nuts, whether that's NDE or paranormal or supernatural events. And people, broadcast their information, usually without judgment, hopefully. And will it get to that point when somebody is like, oh, that thing that you saw, here's what it really was, or that thing that you experienced, here's how you should interpret that. And I hope that doesn't happen.
Well,
That's all I'm saying.
I have a lot to say about this. And every major religion in the world was founded by a mystical experience. Muhammad,
Yes.
Jesus, every one of them. Then what happens is that they go away, and the people who haven't had mystical experiences write down their words and interpret them. Yes, that's a distinct possibility, but mystics in general mysticism abhors institutionalization.
Yay.
Period. And so here I am, and I'm in this odd position. I went into the church. I came back. One of the after effects of my near-death experience. Oh, I'll come back to myself in a minute, by way of big explanation. I'm not worried about NDErs. I don't think anybody's going to be able to convince anybody else with the meaning of the symbols that they saw and their experiences, because they know that they're symbols. And because they know that they're symbols, because they had no self when they were there, no body when they were there, no physicality when they were there, they're free to interpret it themselves. In the cultural context, yes. And someone might have an influence over them saying, have you considered this context? But in the core of their hearts, if they look inside themselves, they go to the place there is no language. And in the place of no language beyond that place of ideas, there's only the beingness of God. And so which is one of my greatest strengths personally, is that I know religion is a useful tool, but it is not the thing itself. And it's been very destructive as well. I'm more concerned about somebody starting a religion. I am, but not with NDErs. And so part of the way that I present myself in the world is just that. Let's not start a religion. Let's make sure that doesn't happen. And part of what I'm doing in my part to make that happen is I want to talk about language. I talk about linguistics. I want to talk about historical religious texts on a global scale and the symbolism found within them, and see that they actually do describe similar experiences. And so when you get to the place where you understand that language is, as you mentioned earlier, words are symbols, but they're symbols of ideas and concepts. They're not things, and they're not the experience. They're expressions of approximations. And when in the mystical community, all mystics speak in metaphor. Jesus, Rumi, Hafez, Teresa of Avila, everybody's talking in metaphor and simile. And that is the message. When people understand that all religious language is metaphor, simile, symbol, and myth, when that message gets across, then we're going to be a little safer from religion. That doesn't mean that some money-hungry power person out there is not going to want to try to co-opt it, but it's really difficult to convince a mystic of that. Mystics are like, nah, I don't think so. So I worked in religion. So here I am. I come back from my near-death experience, and I had been raised Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox. I had a born-again experience. I was also smoking pot, and I dropped acid a bunch of times. And so I was sort of a backslider, but I was still a born-again charismatic Christian. And when I came back, I had zero faith. My belief was gone. In my experience of the divine, there was no religion, and there was no gender. way far beyond these things is the holiness of the divine. And so I came back without the capacity to believe. So it wasn't like I stopped believing. It's like I don't have that capacity anymore because it's been totally replaced by knowing that the divine is beyond language. And so what was I going to do with myself? Where was I going to hide? How could I pursue this thing? I had this voice inside me calling my soul name all the time, telling me to speak the unspeakable. And so I decided to change my future. I didn't go into graduate school in architecture. Instead, I went to Yale Divinity School to study mysticism. It wasn't the only school I applied to. They didn't teach mysticism there, but they had a professor who was there at the time who was a mystic. His name was Henry Nouwen. But when I arrived, he had shifted to Harvard. And then I was like, now what am I going to do? So the dean of students allowed me in 3-year independent study of classical Western mysticism. So I immersed myself in the literature of my peer group of all these dead mystical people who understood the pursuit of oneness of being. And so I positioned myself in such a way as to be hopefully able to be a person who can talk about, through an expertise of understanding what mysticism is and how it works, how language matters. And the whole idea is don't attach to the language. The language matters insofar as that they're full of myths and symbols and metaphors and similes, and they're trying to communicate the ineffable, but don't attach to the language system.
What is a mystic? And is there such a thing as a modern mystic?
Oh yeah, you're talking to one. And,
Okay.
And a mystic, a definition of a mystic comes from the Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, who was the founder of American psychology at the turn of the 1900s. He's from Scotland, but lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and taught at Harvard. And he had a collection of lectures he gave in Glasgow that were then collated into this book, Varieties of Religious Experience, in which there is a chapter titled Mysticism. And this is the definition which aligns with everything I've ever read about mysticism. This is why I use it. So there are 4 components in my own language, 4 components of mysticism, of characteristics of a mystical experience. Mystical experience is passive. You don't do it to yourself. It's a passive experience. It happens to you. You don't make it happen. Has a beginning and an end. It doesn't last forever. It can last a long time. I've talked to people that had ongoing experience for 1.5 years. That's never been my thing, but they always end. No, they leave noetic knowledge. Noetic, also called wisdom in the Christian tradition. It doesn't have anything to do with head knowledge. It doesn't have to do with learning. It has to do with a message that's left inside the soul, inside the higher self, that is inaccessible to reason and analysis and language. But its lodging is there, and it can be found and known, and it's ineffable. It can't ever be said. So passive, transient, noetic, ineffable.
So those are sort of what I'll call common markers, maybe.
Yes.
Are there stages? Do they have to come in stages?
Well, there can be stages, but they're not always in a linear sequence. You can have a mystical experience of a high order, and then you're on rung number 9 out of 10, and then you're back at rung 1 again.
Okay.
But the message the noetic knowledge that it leaves inside of you is consistent and constant and never ending. Access to that 9th rung, but you're not in that same place anymore.
And does one have to recognize that they are a mystic to be a mystic?
Oh, no. You can be utterly, completely blind to the definition because it has nothing to do with knowledge. It has to do with... So a lot of people have mystical experiences. I love to use this example. You have an after-death communication. That's how our conversation began this morning. And we had this... You have an after-death communication. And I've seen this. I was a pastor for 18 years, and in my community, I regularly ran into people who had visitations from the dead. And it was always told to me in a whisper, in the beginning anyway. In the end, I had people announcing it from during the funeral service, not so many years ago. And so when you lose somebody that you love, and you're in a deep state of grief and mourning and shock, and and then suddenly you get a visitation from the dead. Somebody comes and visits you. This very person that you love comes and communicates to you. You're asleep or you're awake, doesn't matter, because they're not confined by your sleeping or your waking. It can happen when you're wide awake in your kitchen. And there's an apparition, an appearance in the dream or in physicality where this person who you love and you know, when they appear to you, communicates to you in a download that's not language. It's not telling you with their mouths. They telepathically communicate to you wellness of being or love or apology or acceptance or any sort of divine truth that you need to hear, and you are changed and they go away and you are changed from that day forward. The course of your life is changed, and what is changed in you in your grief in a noticeable way to you is that you no longer believe that they are gone. You now know that they live out of your reach. You still grieve, but you know that they exist and that they love you and you can love them. And that kind of mystical experience, there might be 50% of the population who's had that, upwards of 49%, 48%. So most people don't recognize that as a mystical experience,
Yep.
but it is, because it has a huge after effect.
At one point, you mentioned that you asked the voice if you had to stay there, and he or she said no. What do you think the voice meant by "you won't live your life"? What did
My
that
life,
mean?
my previous life was completely over. I came back an entirely different person. And I had aspirations of working in my dad's office, working with him in architecture. I've been working toward this my entire life. And I didn't care after that. I lived in, my life was over. My life was over. Peter 1.0 was ended. I was dead. I was supposed to stay dead. I was given the choice, but I was welcomed home. And when I went back, that 1.0 life, that was no longer existed anymore. And I came back and lived an entirely different timeline. So when I saw my parents' lives with and without me, that included everybody around them. I could see an entirely different life for them. And therefore for me, I lived a different life.
Before we close this cast, is there anything else that you'd like to impart to the listener?
Love is really all you need. You don't need a deep life of contemplation. I've chosen this myself, but nobody needs that. All you need to do is love the people you love and let them love you. And if you want to, the only way out is in.
Okay, well, Peter, a warm thank you for your telling of, and it was an epic journey, I think, all around, from what I'll say, the illuminated darkness to the fire of love, to light, or if you will, enlightenment. And I do sincerely appreciate your contribution to this cast. Thanks so much for sticking around and sticking it out with me.
Oh, Kelly, it was an all depth of my heart, my pleasure and my honor, and I thank you. I can feel your heart from here.
Reincarnation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For real.
For real. Now, a lot of people, when they hear reincarnation, they think about, oh yeah, your past lives, or I saw my past life or lives. But did I misunderstand by thinking that you saw future lives?
No, I saw all my lives at once. They weren't future or past. They were all simultaneous. I saw all my lives. I saw all my incarnations, and they were all happening at the same time. And there was like it did sort of look like a baguette, you know. So it did have a and the baguette began at the origin of my beingness, you know, the photon self, and then it stretched off into a very, very, very eons long kind of piece of bread. And the lives I lived were like toothpicks stuck in the side, or skewers stuck in the side of the bread. And they didn't penetrate all the way through, and they were kind of alternatively stacked, and they were very thin in comparison. They amounted, like if I were going to pile up all my lives, they'd be this little tiny pile compared to this huge room that the bread was filling. So they were tiny, tiny compared to the real true self, my whole self. And so they never were me. I was always living in them. And so the result of that part of my experience is that I've never been in pursuit of my other lives. I really don't care where I was in another life because
Mm-hmm.
none of them are me. I'm always in pursuit of the highest self of my original self, my true nature. That's what I actually am. And so I kept my mouth shut about reincarnation when I was a church pastor. I never talked like that. I just talked like me. But I never talked about reincarnation because I needed a job. I was hiding out in the church, and I wasn't about to get fired for some kind of apparent thing that they wouldn't understand anyway. They would have thought I believed in reincarnation, because if I talked about reincarnation, I would have told them that I had died, and I was not going to do that.
I'm inclined to believe that there's a possibility that some of my energy might be somewhere else. Like, I think that it might be like maybe with its tribe or back home or something like that. But I don't know that. Like, I'm separated maybe more than two places at once.
I know that most of me isn't here. A very small portion of me is here.
Mm.
The rest of me is still home.
What do you think it's doing at home?
Well, it's being all these other lives and so much more. It's just, I don't know. I've spent my entire life kind of trying to pull as much of it here as possible, because I'm blind to that. I have certain blindnesses, and one of the blindnesses I have is, like, I can see from myself to here, but and what I see of myself from here is the divine light and not me. So I don't really know what I'm doing on the other side. I don't know, except for looking at me. And so I have certain blindnesses, and that's one of them. I don't know. I just don't know.
When I've heard you speak, is that I'm sensing, maybe this is an exaggeration, but like a sadness.
Oh yeah.
With you. And this might be extreme, but did you ever go through a point where you thought it would be better to end it?
Every effing day.
Yeah.
For 20 years. Every day.
What kept you not doing that?
Well, when I was dead and I saw myself as creature, created, I knew that I couldn't uncreate myself. Not my duty to uncreate myself. And not just in my physical form, but I can't uncreate my higher self. I am still creature there. And I can't take my own life. And, so I prayed for my own death every day for decades, because I didn't want to be here anymore. I felt like when I first came back and this roaring sound was inside of me, my voice, my name being called inside of me without sound, without like language, but there was this roar, like a waterfall inside of me all the time. And it was telling me to speak. And I was pretty upset that I didn't understand what the contract was. I felt like I got misled. I was angry that I didn't understand what the deal that I was making when I came back, because this place here, in comparison, is really ugly. I live in a beautiful place on purpose because I like high aesthetic because it feeds my soul, but in comparison, it's ugly. It's flat, it's two-dimensional, it's black and white, it flickers, it's insubstantial, it's thin, it's weak, there's light here too. Okay, so I see the light all the time leaking through all these corners. He's a spiritual master among the Lakota and in southern Canada and in northwestern United States, so in that Montana sort of South Dakota, Alberta, BC area, Saskatchewan. He says, in my culture, Peter, we just figure it was his time to go. And that totally shifted my understanding. I've seen all the devastation it causes, and I don't encourage. I frequently and regularly counsel people who are suicidal, because it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But I also understand why people do it.
All right, Peter, I will let you get on with your day. And again, thanks for sticking around.
Hey, thanks for having me on your show. I knew that this was going to be great from the moment we first talked. I'm glad I said yes with you.
I'm glad that you did too. Okay. All right. Well, take good care. Same with spirit animals. I wasn't one for that. Had a very, very strange experience that happened to me. Had a hunting bird. The long and the short of it is, it came right up to my face where I could see its membrane of its eyes. And then it was flying, but it extended its wings so that it could, you know how they push back so that they can turn in their direction? Well, that's what happened. Oh, do I hear a chickadee?
You do.
Isn't that interesting? Now, is that not one of your spirit animals?
It is my spirit animal, I think.
Yeah.
It's my
Okay.
chickadees
Well,
are my friends. There's one who came up to my face.
Well, thank that chickadee for letting me know that it was there as I was talking about spirit animals. So it's those little synchronicities that I always find kind of interesting, and I'm always trying to be open to, I guess.
Amen to that.
Yeah. I would like to keep this cast a commercial-free zone. In light of that, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channels. All my orb videos are available by using the handle @Spirit Orbs Sightings, or visit my new channel with the handle @Orbicle Times Podcast. If you've already subscribed, many thanks. For blogs, episodes, show notes, bios, images, and video, please visit www.orbicletimes.com. If you enjoyed an episode, then please give a like or a share on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, or whatever podcatcher you happen to use. If you've already done so, much appreciated. Thank you for taking your time to visit these Orbicle Times. Orbicle Times Podcast is written, produced, edited, and hosted by me, Kelly Jo, at Studio Spare Room.